Chapter 1. The Rise of Kwaku Dua I, the Warrior King of Ashanti. In the heart of West Africa, during the late 18th century, a boy was born who would one day carry the weight of an empire on his shoulders. His name was Kwaku Dua, born in 1797 in Kumasi, the capital of the Ashanti Empire. At the time of his birth, the Ashanti stood as one of the most powerful kingdoms on the African continent, a state forged in war, gold, and tradition. Yet it was also a kingdom facing threats both within and beyond its borders. Kwaku Dua grew up surrounded by the grandeur of the royal court and the strict discipline of Ashanti culture. The palace was not only a symbol of wealth and splendor but also a place of constant intrigue. Young Kwaku learned quickly that to survive in Kumasi, one needed not just bloodline but also sharp intelligence, courage, and the ability to inspire loyalty. As a child, he trained in the art of war. He learned to handle the sword of the Ashanti, to ride war horses, and to study the strategies of his ancestors. By the time he reached manhood, Kwaku Dua was no longer simply a prince. He was a seasoned fighter, respected for his discipline and admired for his ability to command. Those who saw him in training often said he carried himself not like a youth but like a born king. The Ashanti Empire, however, was restless. By the 1830s, succession disputes tore at the royal line. Kings came and went, often dying violently or leaving the throne in turmoil. When Asante Osayo Akoto died in 1834, the stool of the Ashanti throne was once again contested. Rival factions gathered in Kumasi, each seeking to place their own candidate on the Golden Stool, the sacred symbol of Ashanti unity and power. It was in this moment of uncertainty that Kwaku Dua emerged as the man of destiny. Backed by influential chiefs and warriors who had grown tired of instability, he was chosen to ascend as Asante Kwaku Dua I. His coronation was not just a political act but a promise of renewal. The drums thundered through Kumasi, gold dust was sprinkled in the air, and the people cheered the arrival of a king who seemed strong enough to guide them through troubled times. But a crown in Ashanti was not simply a prize to wear. It was a responsibility, a burden, and often a curse. From the very beginning of his reign, Kwaku Dua knew that enemies lurked in the shadows. Neighboring states tested his strength. Traders and envoys from the coast whispered of British ambitions to control the lands of gold and trade. Inside his empire, rival factions watched closely, ready to strike if he faltered. To secure his throne, Kwaku Dua acted with both caution and power. He consolidated alliances, rewarded loyal chiefs, and punished those who conspired against him. In council, he was patient and deliberate, listening before he spoke. In the field, however, he was decisive. His presence on the battlefield inspired confidence among his warriors. With sword in hand and kente cloth flowing around his shoulders, he led charges that broke enemy lines and crushed rebellions. One early story tells of Kwaku Dua standing before his troops, lifting his sword to the sky. Smoke rose behind him as drums echoed across the valley. His soldiers, armed with muskets, bows, and shields, looked to him in silence. Then, with a single command, he sent them running forward in unison, their cries shaking the ground. It was this ability to transform discipline into fury, to lead not from behind but from the front, that earned him the respect of his people. Yet Kwaku Dua was more than a warrior. He was also a diplomat. He welcomed Muslim clerics from the north, allowing them to settle in Kumasi and spread their faith. He opened channels of trade and negotiation with Europeans while carefully guarding the sovereignty of his empire. He knew that power alone could not preserve the Ashanti. Wisdom and adaptability were just as important. The reign of Kwaku Dua I would last for 33 years, making him one of the longest-serving rulers of the Ashanti Empire. His time on the throne would test him with wars, diplomacy, betrayals, and shifting tides of power. But in those first years, what the people saw most clearly was his strength. For the first time in decades, they felt secure under a leader who seemed born to rule. The boy from Kumasi had become the king of kings. And as the drums of the Ashanti beat through the forests of West Africa, a new chapter in African history began, one that would shape the fate of an empire. Chapter 2: securing the throne, the first battles of Kwaku Dua I. The year was 1834, and the throne of the Ashanti Empire had passed into the hands of Kwaku Dua I. His coronation was celebrated with great fanfare, but beneath the sound of drums and the glow of gold lay dangerous truths. A new king always faced enemies, and for Kwaku Dua, the early years of his reign would prove to be a battlefield of survival. The Ashanti Empire was not just a state. It was a collection of powerful clans, chiefs, and warriors bound together by loyalty to the Golden Stool, the sacred throne of the Ashanti people. To protect the stool meant protecting the soul of the nation. To fail in defending it meant dishonor and collapse. For Kwaku Dua, the weight of the stool pressed heavily on his shoulders from the moment he claimed it. Several chiefs doubted his right to rule. Some had favored rival candidates, and saw him as a compromise rather than a true warrior king. In the forests beyond Kumasi, whispers of rebellion began to spread. Kwaku Dua acted quickly. He summoned his council of war, gathering generals and advisors in the palace courtyard. There, under the shade of tall trees, he spoke plainly. "Loyalty to the stool is loyalty to the Ashanti," he declared. "Those who raise their weapons against the king, raise them against our ancestors. We will answer them not with words, but with fire." The message was clear. The Ashanti would not tolerate division. Soon after, one of the first tests of his rule came. A powerful rival chief refused to acknowledge his authority, rallying warriors and preparing for open defiance. Kwaku Dua did not wait for rebellion to grow. He marched. Accounts tell of his army moving through the forests in disciplined formations, their colorful tent cloths wrapped tightly, muskets polished, shields raised. War drums beat a steady rhythm, echoing through the valleys. At the front rode Kwaku Dua himself, mounted on a horse draped in gold and crimson. Unlike some rulers who commanded from a safe distance, he placed himself where his men could see him. His presence gave courage, his eyes steady, his sword gleaming in the sunlight. When the battle began, the forest roared with musket fire. Smoke drifted between the trees as warriors charged with spears and cutlasses. Kwaku Dua raised his sword and gave a single command. His army surged forward in unison, overwhelming the rebels with sheer force and discipline. In hours, the rebellion collapsed. The rival chief was captured and brought before him. Kwaku Dua did not act rashly. Instead of immediate execution, he made an example. He stripped the chief of his power, humiliated him publicly, and allowed his fate to serve as a warning to others. Mercy, when combined with strength, could be more effective than blood. This victory set the tone for his reign. The Ashanti people saw that their king was both a warrior and a strategist. He could fight, but he also understood how to rule. He showed not only the might of the sword but also the wisdom of restraint. His enemies began to fear him. His allies began to respect him. Yet securing the throne was not only about crushing rebellion. Kwaku Dua understood that the Ashanti Empire's strength lay in unity. He traveled through the empire, visiting towns and villages, rewarding chiefs who had shown loyalty, and ensuring that the people felt connected to the Golden Stool. Wherever he went, he carried himself as both king and servant, reminding the Ashanti that his rule was for the people as much as for himself. Meanwhile, he kept a close eye on the coast. Reports reached him of British officials expanding their control over trade routes, building forts, and tightening their grip on commerce. The Ashanti had long dealt with Europeans, exchanging gold and slaves for guns and goods, but the growing power of the British was becoming a shadow on the horizon. Kwaku Dua knew that one day, he would have to face them. But before looking outward, he had to make sure his empire was strong within. The early campaigns of Kwaku Dua I secured more than his throne. They restored faith in the stability of the Ashanti state. For the first time in years, the people felt that their empire had a leader who would not be pushed aside or defeated by rivals. As night fell in Kumasi, fires lit the courtyards where warriors celebrated their victories. The drums of the Ashanti echoed across the forests. At the center of it all sat Kwaku Dua, the young king who had proven himself in battle. His face was calm, his eyes sharp. He knew that greater trials lay ahead. Rebellions could be crushed, but the storm gathering on the coast would test not only his sword but the very survival of the Ashanti Empire. The warrior king had secured his throne, but the true battles of his reign were only beginning. Chapter 3: Diplomacy and the Shadow of the British. By the mid-1830s, Ashanti Kwaku Dua I had secured his throne. His swift victories over rebellious chiefs restored order and proved that he was no figurehead. Yet as he sat on the Golden Stool, surrounded by the wealth and power of Kumasi, he knew that the greatest dangers to the Ashanti Empire did not come only from within. They were also moving along the coast, wearing red coats and carrying muskets stamped with the mark of Britain. The British presence on the Gold Coast had been growing for decades. They built forts, controlled trade routes, and slowly pressed their influence inland. For the Ashanti, who had long dominated the region's commerce in gold, ivory, and slaves, this was a challenge to both power and survival. Kwaku Dua understood this better than most. He had grown up watching European traders barter at the edge of Ashanti territory. He knew they were more than merchants. They were conquerors. But he also understood the art of diplomacy. Unlike some kings who answered every challenge with war, Kwaku Dua moved carefully. He opened channels of negotiation with the British, Dutch, and other coastal powers. He welcomed envoys into Kumasi, offering them hospitality while studying their intentions. He treated foreign merchants with courtesy, but he never let them forget whose land they stood on. In the palace courtyard, he received European visitors in grand ceremonies. Gold ornaments shone in the sunlight. Chiefs and warriors lined the paths. The drums of the Ashanti announced his presence as he emerged, wrapped in brilliant kente cloth, the weight of authority in every step. His words were calm, his gestures deliberate. He projected confidence, ensuring that the Ashanti looked not like supplicants, but like equals in power. Behind this display, however, Kwaku Dua was always watching. He instructed his scribes and advisors to keep records of every deal, every shipment of muskets, every promise made by Europeans. He understood that knowledge was as important as strength. To defend the empire, he needed to know the motives of those who sought to undermine it. At the same time, he worked to strengthen the Ashanti army. He encouraged the importation of firearms, ensuring that his warriors remained well armed. He supported training that combined traditional combat with the discipline required from musket warfare. Ashanti fighters were already fierce, but under his guidance, they became more organized. They could fight in the thick forests of the interior as easily as on open fields. There are stories of Kwaku Dua inspecting his troops personally, walking between the lines of warriors, stopping to test their muskets, or demanding demonstrations of discipline. He was not a distant ruler. He wanted his men to feel his presence, to know that the king was not only a commander in words, but a soldier in spirit. His diplomacy extended beyond Europe. Kwaku Dua welcomed Muslim clerics from the north, allowing them to settle in Kumasi. These scholars brought not only religious knowledge but also literacy in Arabic, new trade networks, and military expertise. By embracing diversity, he made Kumasi a center of both commerce and culture. This tolerance strengthened his rule, showing his people that the empire was open to new ideas without losing its traditions. Still, shadows loomed. The British grew increasingly determined to expand inland. Their officials wrote of civilizing missions, but their true motives were clear: control of trade and territory. The more they tightened their grip on the coast, the more likely conflict with the Ashanti became. Kwaku Dua was no fool. He spoke of peace in public, but in private council, he warned his chiefs. The Europeans smile with one hand and take with the other. We will deal with them as long as it suits us. But we must always be ready. Under his reign, Kumasi flourished. Markets overflowed with gold dust, kola nuts, ivory, and imported goods. Foreign visitors marveled at the wealth and organization of the city. The palace stood as a symbol of stability. For the first time in many years, the Ashanti Empire looked united, confident, and strong. But history is never still. Kwaku Dua could see that the path of the Ashanti was leading toward greater trials. The British would not remain at the coast forever. Their ambitions would eventually collide with Ashanti pride. For now, diplomacy and preparation kept the peace. Yet every musket fired in training, every drumbeat in the forests, carried the same unspoken truth: the day would come when words no longer mattered, and the survival of the Ashanti would depend once again on the strength of its warriors. The Ashanti king stood between two worlds. One hand held the sword of war. The other extended in diplomacy. For 3 decades, this balance would define his reign. But peace balanced on the edge of a blade, and even the strongest kings could not hold back the tide of empire forever. Chapter 4: Tension on the Horizon, Ashanti and the British. By the early 1840s, the Ashanti Empire stood proud under the rule of Ashanti Kwaku Dua I. Kumasi thrived as a capital of wealth and power, its markets overflowing with gold dust, ivory, and trade goods. Chiefs from across the empire pledged loyalty to the Golden Stool, and the sound of drums carried the message of unity deep into the forests. For the people of Ashanti, the first decade of Kwaku Dua's reign brought stability not seen in a generation. But peace never lasted long in West Africa, especially with the British pushing ever further inland. From their forts on the coast, they tightened their grip on trade. They wanted more than gold and ivory. They wanted dominance. For years they had signed treaties, promising friendship, but their actions revealed a different ambition. Step by step, they cut into Ashanti influence on the coast, weakening Ashanti allies and raising new barriers to inland trade. Kwaku Dua saw it clearly. Reports from chiefs near the coast told of British officials interfering with markets, seizing goods, and undermining local rulers who supported the Ashanti. Every incident was a spark. Any spark could ignite a war. In council, the Ashanti kings spoke firmly. The British wish to choke us slowly. They cannot defeat us in battle, so they cut away at our trade. But we will not bow. If they bring fire, we will bring thunder. The chiefs nodded in agreement, but Kwaku Dua was careful. He understood that while the Ashanti could fight with unmatched courage, war with the British would not be simple. The British had ships, heavy guns, and endless supplies from overseas. The Ashanti had warriors, strategy, and the strength of unity. For now, he chose patience, preparing his empire for the day when words would no longer hold the enemy back. He ordered fresh stockpiles of muskets and gunpowder, ensuring his warriors were well armed. He encouraged discipline in the army, drilling soldiers in formations that could resist the British style of fighting. At the same time, he strengthened alliances with northern neighbors, drawing trade routes away from British-controlled ports when possible. But the tension was not only external. Inside the empire, rival factions still lingered in the shadows, whispering against the king. Kwaku Dua knew that the British would exploit any sign of weakness. To counter this, he traveled across the empire, showing his presence in distant towns and rewarding loyalty with gold and titles. Chiefs who remained faithful were celebrated, while those suspected of treachery were watched closely. One story tells of him riding into a distant town where discontent had been brewing. Instead of sending soldiers to intimidate the people, he arrived in full regalia, greeted the chiefs with gifts, and spoke of unity. His words carried both warning and reassurance. The empire is strongest when we walk together. Alone, a man may be cut down. Together, we are unbreakable. The unrest melted, replaced by renewed loyalty. Even as he managed his empire, the British presence on the coast grew louder. Missionaries wrote back to London, describing Kumasi as both magnificent and threatening. Traders demanded stronger British intervention to protect their interests. Officials began drafting policies that aimed not only at trade but at reshaping the entire region under British influence. By the mid-1840s, tension had turned into open hostility. The Ashanti demanded access to coastal markets. The British restricted them. Disputes over treaties grew sharper. Skirmishes broke out between Ashanti allies and coastal states backed by Britain. Each clash brought the two powers closer to war. In Kumasi, the people looked to their king. Kwaku Dua continued to project strength, but he knew the reality. The Ashanti were walking a thin line. Too much aggression could bring a full-scale war before the empire was ready. Too much patience could allow the British to weaken them further. He chose a path of measured resistance. His warriors stood ready, drilling in the forests, muskets at their sides. His envoys traveled to the coast, demanding fair trade and reminding the British that the Ashanti were not subjects but sovereign rulers. And in the palace, the Golden Stool remained untouched, glowing in the dim light, a constant reminder of what was truly at stake. The Ashanti Empire was more than gold or territory. It was identity, tradition, and the blood of generations. Kwaku Dua knew that if the British ever tried to challenge the soul of his people, the response would not be words. It would be fire. As the 1840s gave way to the 1850s, the tension became a storm on the horizon. Trade disputes, broken treaties, and rival claims piled higher each year. The drums of war began to echo once more across the forests. The Ashanti king had secured his throne, balanced diplomacy, and strengthened his army. Now he stood on the edge of history, facing a future where the empire would be tested by one of the most powerful colonial forces in the world. The calm before the storm had ended. What lay ahead would decide not only the fate of Kwaku Dua's reign but the destiny of the Ashanti people. Chapter 5: The First Clashes, Ashanti Fire against the British. By the early 1850s, the fragile balance between the Ashanti Empire and the British colonial forces began to crack. Years of disputes over trade routes, broken treaties, and political interference had reached their boiling point. The drums of war echoed again, and the Ashanti people prepared to defend their empire under the leadership of Ashanti Kwaku Dua I. The trouble began at the coast. For generations, the Ashanti had relied on access to ports to control trade in gold, ivory, and slaves. But the British, determined to dominate commerce, tightened restrictions. They supported coastal states hostile to Ashanti power, cutting off routes and blocking Ashanti envoys. Each move was designed to weaken Kumasi's influence. To the Ashanti, this was not trade negotiation. It was warfare in disguise. When word reached Kumasi that Ashanti envoys had been insulted and their goods seized, Kwaku Dua I called his council of chiefs and generals. In the great palace courtyard, with the Golden Stool at the center, he spoke to them with the authority of a king and the fire of a warrior. "The British think we are blind," he declared. "They believe we will bow as others have bowed. But the Ashanti do not kneel. If they strike at us with one hand, we will strike back with both." The chiefs roared their approval, striking their shields with spears in unison. War preparations began immediately. Messengers carried commands through the forests, summoning warriors from every corner of the empire. The markets of Kumasi rang with the sound of blacksmiths sharpening swords and repairing muskets. Women prepared supplies of food and cloth for the army, while priests performed rituals to call upon the ancestors for victory. When the Ashanti army marched, it was a sight that terrified enemies and inspired allies. Thousands of warriors moved through the dense forests in disciplined formations. Their kente cloths blazed with color, their shields polished, their muskets slung across their backs. At the head of the column rode Kwaku Dua himself, mounted on a powerful horse draped in crimson and gold. Unlike the distant generals of Europe, he placed himself where his men could see him, a living symbol of courage and command. The first clashes came not in open battle but in raids and skirmishes. British-supported coastal states resisted Ashanti advances, forcing sharp engagements in the forests and on narrow trade roads. Ashanti warriors, masters of guerrilla tactics, struck quickly, ambushing enemy columns before vanishing into the trees. British reports spoke of sudden attacks, war drums echoing through the night, and soldiers caught in a storm of musket fire before they could even see their enemies. One story from these early confrontations tells of Kwaku Dua himself standing on a ridge, raising his sword as the Ashanti charged. Smoke from muskets filled the air, and the forest shook with the cries of warriors. When a group of British-supported fighters tried to flank his army, the king ordered a swift maneuver, sending a hidden unit crashing into their side. The enemy line broke, scattering into chaos. Victory belonged to the Ashanti. But these battles were costly. The British possessed advanced weapons, including heavy artillery that could tear through Ashanti formations if given the chance. Their supply lines from the coast were strong, reinforced by ships and forts. The Ashanti, while powerful, had to rely on the discipline of their warriors and the strategy of their king. Kwaku Dua understood this challenge. He did not waste his men in reckless charges. Instead, he fought with patience, using the forests as shields and the element of surprise as his greatest weapon. "The forest is our fortress," he told his generals. "The British have their cannons. We have the trees, the rivers, and the spirits of our ancestors." These early confrontations did not bring decisive victory or defeat. Instead, they hardened both sides. The British learned to fear the speed and ferocity of Ashanti attacks. The Ashanti learned to respect the firepower of British guns. Each skirmish was a warning. The next war would not be a border dispute. It would be a struggle for survival. Back in Kumasi, the people celebrated the victories of their warriors, but Kwaku Dua did not allow triumph to turn into arrogance. He reminded his chiefs that the British were not ordinary enemies. They were persistent, patient, and ruthless. He strengthened discipline, demanded more weapons, and ensured that his army was never unprepared. For the Ashanti king, these clashes were more than battles. They were lessons. Every musket fired, every ambush carried out, taught him about the enemy he would one day face in full-scale war. The British were not invincible. They could bleed, and they could be beaten. But they were also relentless. Kwaku Dua knew that the first clashes were only the beginning. The storm was gathering, and soon the empire would be tested as never before. The Ashanti Empire stood ready, its king at the front, sword in hand, eyes fixed on the horizon where war with the British loomed closer each day. Chapter 6: Balancing War and Diplomacy. The first clashes between the Ashanti Empire and the British colonial forces had shown both sides what they were dealing with. The Ashanti had proven that they could fight with ferocity, using the forests as shields and discipline as their weapon. The British, in turn, had demonstrated the power of their guns and the reach of their forts along the coast. Neither side could claim victory, but neither side was ready to retreat. For Ashanti Kwaku Dua I, this was a dangerous moment. He had secured his throne, unified his chiefs, and shown the strength of his warriors. But he also knew the truth: if war with the British dragged on, the empire would face immense strain. Trade would falter, supply lines would dry up, and the people could suffer. To preserve the Ashanti, he needed not only warriors but also wisdom. That wisdom lay in balance. Kwaku Dua refused to give up the fight, but he also refused to plunge his people into reckless war. Instead, he began a strategy of measured diplomacy. From Kumasi, he sent envoys to the coast, men skilled in negotiation and persuasion. They carried messages of peace but also warnings. The Ashanti were ready to fight if provoked. These envoys were instructed to watch carefully, to learn everything they could about the British: how many soldiers they had, what goods they wanted most, and which African states they sought as allies. Knowledge was as valuable as any musket. When British officials arrived in Kumasi, Kwaku Dua staged elaborate ceremonies. The palace sparkled with gold ornaments, and chiefs lined the courtyard in full regalia. The Golden Stool sat in its place of honor, reminding all that the power of the Ashanti was sacred and unbroken. The king greeted the British with courtesy, his voice calm, his manner measured. Yet beneath the surface, every gesture was calculated. He wanted the foreigners to see wealth, discipline, and strength, not weakness. At the same time, he worked tirelessly to strengthen the empire from within. He expanded trade with northern neighbors, ensuring that the Ashanti were not fully dependent on coastal routes. He welcomed Muslim clerics, whose literacy and networks opened new avenues of commerce and knowledge. In Kumasi, he supported artisans, traders, and farmers, keeping the economy alive even under the pressure of British interference. Most importantly, he continued to prepare the army. The first clashes had revealed the need for more muskets and better training. Kwaku Dua ensured that traders brought weapons inland, paying in gold dust when necessary. He ordered new drills, teaching his warriors to move in disciplined lines as well as in guerrilla formations. The forests of Ashanti echoed with the sound of musket fire, practice for the battles that everyone knew were coming. One story from this period tells of Kwaku Dua inspecting his army in the field. Thousands of warriors stood in formation, muskets at their sides, shields shining in the sun. He rode along the line, mounted on a warhorse draped in crimson cloth. He stopped often, testing the sharpness of a blade, checking the weight of a musket, demanding precision in their movements. When he finally spoke, his words carried across the field. "The British believe they can break us with their cannons. But cannons do not know the forests. Muskets do not know our spirits. We will fight with discipline, and when the time comes, we will not bend." The warriors roared in answer, striking their shields in unison. To them, their king was more than a ruler. He was the embodiment of Ashanti strength. Even as he prepared for war, Kwaku Dua never abandoned diplomacy. He signed treaties when they benefited the Ashanti, broke them when they threatened the empire, and used every negotiation as a way to buy time. Time to arm, time to train, time to make sure that when war truly came, the Ashanti would meet it as equals. The British, for their part, grew frustrated. They saw Kwaku Dua's diplomacy as stalling tactics. Missionaries complained of restrictions, traders demanded more access, and colonial officials wrote reports describing Kumasi as both magnificent and dangerous. London wanted the Ashanti subdued, but the king's careful balance kept them at bay. Still, Kwaku Dua understood that diplomacy could only delay the inevitable. The British were not a passing threat. They were an empire of their own, expanding across continents. Eventually, their ambition would clash directly with Ashanti sovereignty. In Kumasi, life went on. The markets bustled, the palace glowed with gold, and the festivals of the Ashanti filled the air with music and color. But beneath the surface, everyone knew the truth. They were living in the calm before the storm. Kwaku Dua had bought his people time to strengthen, time to prepare, time to stand ready. But storms do not wait forever, and the horizon was already darkening. Chapter 7: The Escalation of Hostilities. By the late 1850s, the Ashanti Empire stood at a crossroads. For nearly 2 decades, Asantehene Kwaku Dua I had walked a careful line, balancing diplomacy with readiness for war. His patience had kept the empire strong, but the storm he had long foreseen was now gathering speed. On the coast, the British colonial forces grew bolder. They pushed deeper inland, forging alliances with African states hostile to the Ashanti, and interfering more aggressively with trade routes. Every move was a calculated attempt to weaken Kumasi's influence. Traders who once served the Ashanti were bribed to shift loyalty. Chiefs on the periphery of the empire were courted with gifts, promises, and the threat of British firepower. In Kumasi, Kwaku Dua watched these developments with steady eyes. He had seen the British strategy clearly: divide and conquer. But he also knew the Ashanti were not like the smaller states of the coast. They were bound by the Golden Stool, by centuries of tradition, and by the spirit of their ancestors. Breaking them would not be so simple. Still, the provocations grew harder to ignore. British officials insulted Ashanti envoys, dismissed their treaties, and demanded concessions that no proud empire could accept. Skirmishes flared once again along the borders, where Ashanti warriors clashed with coastal allies backed by British muskets. Each skirmish carried the risk of full war. To prepare, Kwaku Dua doubled his efforts to unite the empire. He summoned his chiefs to Kumasi for great councils, reminding them of their duty to the Golden Stool. In these gatherings, the palace courtyards thundered with speeches, drums, and oaths of loyalty. Chiefs swore to defend the empire, warriors pledged to fight until death, and priests performed rituals to strengthen the spiritual shield around the Ashanti. One such council is remembered in Ashanti lore. Standing before the gathered chiefs, Kwaku Dua raised his voice so that all could hear. "The British come with treaties in one hand and chains in the other. They believe their cannons will frighten us into submission. But we are the Ashanti. We do not kneel. The Golden Stool is not theirs to claim. If they bring war to our land, they will find a fire that cannot be extinguished." The chiefs struck their shields in thunderous approval. The message was clear: unity was survival. Meanwhile, the Ashanti army continued to grow stronger. Warriors drilled in the forests, their muskets echoing like thunder through the trees. The courtyards were alive with the pounding of drums, the wail of horns, and the chanting of warriors. The air was heavy with anticipation. The Ashanti raised his staff and spoke with measured force. The British believe they can choke us with treaties and traps. They believe we will surrender our land, our trade, and our pride. But hear me, sons of Ashanti. The Golden Stool is not theirs to touch. Our ancestors' blood waters this soil. If the storm comes, we will not run. We will fight as one, as the spirit of Ashanti has always demanded. The chiefs roared their approval. Some pounded their shields with their swords, others shouted oaths to defend the Golden Stool until their last breath. In those moments, unity spread like fire through the empire. In the villages, warriors sharpened their blades, muskets were cleaned, and drums of war were carved anew. The Ashanti army swelled with young men eager to prove themselves. They drilled in the forests that had long been the empire's shield, learning how to move like shadows, strike without warning, and vanish before the enemy could counter. The forests were more than terrain, they were allies, and the Ashanti knew every tree, every stream, every hidden path. Yet Kwaku Dua I was careful. He did not rush headlong into battle. He sent envoys to the coast, demanding once more that the British respect Ashanti sovereignty. His words carried strength but also a warning. He hoped still that diplomacy might avoid the bloodshed he knew would be immense. But the envoys returned with reports of British arrogance. The colonial officials dismissed Ashanti demands, treating them as empty threats. Inside Kumasi, preparations continued. Women worked tirelessly, weaving cloth, pounding yam, and storing provisions for the army. Priests offered sacrifices and interpreted signs from the gods. The omens were clear, war was near, and it would test the empire's soul. Despite the looming threat, daily life continued. The markets bustled, children played in the courtyards, and festivals were held with the usual songs and dances. This was the resilience of the Ashanti. Even as war drew near, they carried on with pride, knowing that their identity, rooted in tradition and spirit, was unshakable. For the British, the situation looked different. Their reports spoke of an empire unwilling to submit, of a king who would not bend. They saw Kwaku Dua not as a leader of a proud civilization, but as an obstacle to their colonial ambitions. Their arrogance blinded them to the reality that they were preparing to fight one of the most organized and determined African powers of the century. As the decade wore on, small clashes erupted again on the empire's borders. Skirmishes were fought over trade routes and disputed territories. Each clash was a spark, each spark a threat to ignite a larger fire. The Ashanti warriors returned from these encounters with stories of bravery, their muskets and swords proving that the old spirit of the empire was alive and strong. Kwaku Dua knew the storm was nearly upon them. He often walked at night through the palace courtyards, listening to the drums that echoed through Kumasi. In his heart, he carried both hope and fear. Hope, because the Ashanti were united as never before. Fear, because he knew that war with the British would bring destruction on a scale his people had not yet faced. One evening, he summoned his closest generals. Around a fire, they mapped the forests, the rivers, and the trade routes. The Ashanti spoke with calm authority. If they march on us, we will not wait in Kumasi. We will meet them in the forests. Their cannons are heavy, their soldiers blind in the shadows of our land. There we will strike, and there they will bleed. But remember this. Every warrior fights not only for his family or his village but for the Golden Stool itself. If we fall as Ashanti. If we triumph, the empire lives forever. The generals bowed their heads in agreement. The path was set. By 1865, the air across the Gold Coast was thick with expectation. Both the Ashanti and the British tightened their preparations. Traders, missionaries, and allies watched nervously, sensing that history was about to change. For the Ashanti, the command of Kwaku Dua I had brought decades of unity and strength. Now, in his final years, he prepared his people for the ultimate test. The empire stood unbroken, its warriors sharpened, its chiefs united. The storm was here, and the Ashanti were ready. Chapter 9: The King's Last Watch. By the mid-1860s, the Ashanti Empire was alive with tension. Rumors of war drifted from the coast, carried by traders and envoys. Reports spoke of British cannons being landed at forts, of colonial officers drawing new maps of the land, as if the empire of the Ashanti did not exist. For the people of Kumasi, these whispers were not news, they were confirmation of what Kwaku Dua I had warned for years. The king, now older and marked by decades of rule, walked slower than before, but his eyes remained sharp. In the royal palace, beneath the golden umbrellas and carved pillars, he still sat upon the throne with an authority that none dared question. To his chiefs, he was not merely a king, he was the living embodiment of the Ashanti spirit, the guardian of the Golden Stool, and the voice of the ancestors. As his body aged, his voice seemed to grow stronger. In council meetings, his words cut like iron. The British believe the forests are theirs to walk, the rivers theirs to cross, the trade theirs to steal. But this stool does not belong to them. It belongs to the soul of our people. If they seek it, they will find only fire. The chiefs answered with nods and chants, but they could not ignore the reality. Their king's health was fading. Every decision, every speech carried the weight of a leader who knew time was short. In Kumasi, life carried on, yet there was an unease in the air. The marketplaces were still filled with the cries of sellers and the bright colors of Kent cloth, but behind the chatter, people whispered of the battles to come. Mothers prepared their sons for war. Blacksmiths hammered swords and repaired muskets with urgency. Priests lit fires at shrines, offering sacrifices to ensure the gods would favor the Ashanti once more. Kwaku Dua I often stood at the gates of the palace, looking out at the streams of people who came daily to bring tribute, settle disputes, or pledge loyalty. He thought of the years behind him, the succession disputes he had calmed, the rebellions he had crushed, the treaties he had forged and broken. His reign had been one of the longest and most stable in Ashanti history. Yet as he looked to the future, he knew the storm would arrive after his death, and it grieved him to leave his people on the edge of war. Still, he prepared them. The training of the warriors intensified. The forests surrounding Kumasi became living fortresses, filled with traps, ambush points, and hidden camps. Scouts patrolled the borders day and night, sending word back to the capital. The empire was ready to move at the king's command. The British, however, continued to misread the Ashanti. Colonial officers wrote home of a kingdom past its prime, a ruler too old to resist, a people who would crumble when confronted by modern artillery. They did not see the fire that still burned in Kumasi, nor the unity forged under Kwaku Dua's leadership. One evening, as the drums beat in the palace and torches lit the great hall, the Asantehene called his chiefs together for what would be one of his last great councils. He spoke with calm authority, his voice filling the chamber. "My body weakens, but my spirit does not. If the British believe the Ashanti are tired, let them march and see. I have ruled you for 3 decades, not as a servant of peace alone, but as the guardian of our soul. The day will come when their arrogance forces their hand. When it does, remember what I say tonight, the Golden Stool must never fall. Even if the city burns, even if the rivers run red, protect the stool. For as long as it stands, Ashanti lives." The chiefs bowed deeply, and some wept. The king's words carried the weight of prophecy. In his private chambers, Kwaku Dua I grew more reflective. He spoke often with priests, asking for guidance, and with his family, urging them to remain steadfast. He knew the empire he had nurtured stood at a crossroads. His reign had given stability, but the battles ahead would demand a new kind of strength. By 1867, the king's health declined rapidly. The palace was filled with mourning drums, though he was not yet gone. Crowds gathered outside, praying, singing, and waiting for word. When he finally passed, the empire was plunged into grief. His death marked not only the end of an era but also the beginning of the storm he had warned them about. The people of Kumasi buried him with honor, his name spoken alongside the great Ashantians who had come before. But even in death, his presence lingered. His warnings, his preparations, and his vision for unity remained etched in the hearts of his people. As the drums of mourning faded, another sound began to rise, the drums of war. Chapter 10: Legacy of the Golden Throne. The death of Kwaku Dua I in 1867 marked the end of one of the longest and most influential reigns in the history of the Ashanti Empire. For 33 years, he had steered his people through times of peace and crisis, balancing diplomacy with strength, and ensuring that the Golden Stool, the very soul of the Ashanti nation, remained untouchable. News of his passing spread quickly through the forests, rivers, and towns of the empire. From Kumasi to the farthest provinces, drums carried the message: the king had joined the ancestors. Markets closed, warriors laid down their weapons, and the city was covered in mourning cloth. To the Ashanti, his death was not just the loss of a ruler but the passing of a guardian who had protected their traditions, their lands, and their pride. Yet even as the kingdom grieved, the shadow of war grew larger. The British, emboldened by reports of the king's death, believed the Ashanti throne was vulnerable. They were wrong. The discipline and unity forged under Kwaku Dua's leadership did not vanish with him. His successors inherited not only his throne but also the defensive structures he had prepared, the alliances he had forged, and the spirit of resistance he had instilled in every warrior and chief. The years that followed saw the Ashanti plunge into direct conflict with the British, leading to some of the fiercest battles in West African history. Kumasi itself would face flames during the Segrenti War of 1874, when British forces looted and burned the royal capital. Yet even in the ashes of destruction, one thing remained untouched: the Golden Stool. Just as Kwaku Dua had commanded, it was hidden, protected, and never surrendered to foreign hands. This act of defiance became his lasting gift to his people. By safeguarding the stool, he ensured that even if cities fell and battles were lost, the spiritual and cultural heart of the Ashanti could never be destroyed. Historians often debate Kwaku Dua I's role. Some see him as a stabilizer who delayed inevitable clashes with the British. Others remember him as a visionary who understood that survival required both patience and preparation. For the Ashanti themselves, however, his memory is far simpler and more powerful. He was the king who stood like a shield between his people and the storm, who prepared them for the trials to come, and who never allowed the dignity of the empire to bend. Even today, in the streets of Kumasi, stories of his reign are told alongside those of Osei Tutu, Apokuwer, and other great Asantehens. His decisions to allow religious tolerance, to strengthen military discipline, and to maintain the independence of the Ashanti state are remembered as cornerstones of the empire's endurance. His words, "The Golden Stool must never fall," are still repeated as a lesson in unity, pride, and resistance. The British, with all their cannons and strategies, never fully conquered the Ashanti spirit. That spirit was shaped in large part by the reign of Kwaku Dua I. He did not live to see the wars that erupted after his death, but he laid the foundation that allowed his people to resist with courage and pride. His name is carved into the memory of Africa as a symbol of leadership, resilience, and dignity in the face of empire. In the long history of kings, there are rulers who expand empires, and there are rulers who preserve them. Kwaku Dua I was both. He inherited a throne shaken by disputes and left behind a throne strong enough to face an empire like Britain. His story is not just the tale of one king but the story of an entire people who stood firm against the tide of colonialism. For the Ashanti, the Golden Stool still shines, and so too does the legacy of the man who guarded it. His reign may have ended in 1867, but his spirit walks still in the forests of Ghana, in the drums of Kumasi, and in the unbroken pride of the Ashanti Empire.